How Science Points to God. What to expect from this book? These are the chapters, different kind of sciences. How do they point to God? You can find the book at Amazon.com or SophiaInstitute.com. The first question is there a conflict between science and religion? The conflict theory is a myth, born during the Enlightenment period. Many scientists are religious, many Christians are scientists. Science and religion are not in a battle with each other, but they complement each other. They each have their own outlook on the world. It's like looking at the world through two lenses, different lenses. Father George Lemaitre, who was at the cradle of the Big Bang theory, knew what he was talking about. There is no conflict between religion and science, he said. First of all, there are assumptions behind science. Science can do quite a bit for us, but what it's not able to do is proving its own assumptions. Science would not be possible without the assumption that there is an objectively real world, that the world is comprehensible, that our sensory perception is in essence reliable, that our rationality is reliable, that there is order and uniformity in nature, that mathematics and logic are valid tools of reasoning. Without these assumptions, science would not be possible. These assumptions could not exist without the mind of God. Let chapter 1 of the book How Science Points to God explain this to you in much more detail. Then there are the laws of nature. There is law and order in the universe, under the control of laws of nature. There are many laws of nature. Think, for instance, of the law of gravitation, the 3 laws of motion, the ideal gas laws, or Mendel's laws. The concept of law, Paul Davies writes, is so well established in science that until recently few scientists stopped to think about the nature and origin of these laws. They were happy to simply accept them as a given. The laws of nature could not exist without a divine lawgiver, right? Let chapter 2 of the book Science Points to God explain this to you in much more detail. Let's look into astronomy as another science. The Big Bang may have started the universe, but it could not start itself. That would be pure magic. The Big Bang comes with space and time, but where do these come from? Nothing comes from nothing. For something to create itself, it would have to exist before it came into existence, which is logically and philosophically impossible. For anything to exist, a universe, a law of gravity or anything, there must be something else first that puts them into being. The Big Bang did not replace creation. Without creation, there could not be a Big Bang. The universe could not exist without a creator who called the universe into being. Let chapter 3 of How Science Points to God explain this to you. Then there are physical constants that physics talks about. In addition to gravity, there are 3 other basic forces in nature. I won't go into that into details because you will find that in the book, but I assume that you have heard of them. But what is so special about them is that the values of these constants seem to be a given in the fabric of this universe. They are of a very specific magnitude. Had they been any different, the universe would probably not have been able to launch life. The Book of Wisdom testifies to this. You have arranged all things by measure and number and weight. How profound! Physical constants could not exist without a divine architect who measured, numbered and weighted things. Let chapter 4 of the book How Science Points to God explain this to you in much more detail. Then there is genetics. You know, at the core of genetics nowadays is DNA. Articles written by geneticists are laden with terms such as code, information, message, program, blueprint, and so many more. If it's true that the same information can be transported by different vehicles, such as pen strokes on paper, currents in computers, or DNA in the cell, then the conclusion must be that information is not identical to its carrier. Though it's a DNA molecule, the information in it is not identical to the DNA molecules. Just as mathematics could be called the language of God by Galileo, so could DNA be considered God's language as well, as Francis Collins put it, the man behind the Human Genome Project. DNA could not harbor information without the mind of God. Let chapter 5 of the book How Science Points to God explain this to you in much more detail. And then there is evolution. Evolution is not just a matter of random mutations. Of course, they play a role in it. But randomness is kept in tow by the laws of nature, by the design of the universe. The so-called periodic system, for instance, regulates which reactions of atoms and molecules are possible and which are not. A biological design can be successful only if it's in accordance with the design of the universe. Just as a river follows a path of least resistance, according to the topographic design of the landscape, so does the stream of evolution follow a path somehow regulated by the design of our universe. It is not completely random, it follows a certain pattern. Evolution could not be possible without a divine designer. Let chapter 6 of the book explain this to you in more detail. And then there is neuroscience. Neuroscience is about the mechanism of the brain. Nowadays we know this machinery does not work with cogs and wheels, but with neurons and neurotransmitters, but the idea remains the same. How could such a mechanism ever think, let alone think about itself? The brain cannot study the brain all by itself. Only the mind can study the brain. So the mind must have an other origin than the brain and must be more than the brain. Only the mind makes scientific knowledge possible, not reversed. The mind could not exist without the mind of God. Let chapter 7 of the book explain this to you in much more detail. And then there is the science of semantics. All languages use words to make sentences. Most words have a meaning. They mean something to us and to other users of the same language. Semantics, a field of linguistics, is the science of meaning. It studies the relationship between words and what they refer to, or their reference. What a word refers to depends on its meaning, which is determined by the concept behind that word. Concepts exist in the human intellect. They go far beyond what the senses provide. They transform things of the world into objects of knowledge. The human intellect could never exist without a divine intellect. And chapter 9 of the book explains this to you in detail. And then there is logic and math. What logic and math have in common is that they can lead us on a safe path. Thanks to the laws of logic and math, we are able to argue, debate, reason, prove and disprove. The physicist Eugene Wigner calls this the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. As J.K. Chesterton liked to ask his readers, why should not good logic be as misleading as bad logic? Gottlob Frege points out, for instance, that the thought we have expressed in the theorem of Pythagoras is timelessly true, true independently of whether anyone takes it to be true. It needs no owner. Really? Yet, the theorems like these could never exist without God. Chapter 10 of the book explains this to you in much more detail. And then there is the incompleteness theorem. It was Kurt Gödel who rigorously showed that all efforts to prove strictly that the whole of mathematics and logic is consistent and is free from any contradictions, are doomed to fail. He did so in what became known as the incompleteness theorem. In other words, any complete formal system is inconsistent, while any consistent formal system is incomplete. There is always something missing. Gödel himself could even see his incompleteness theorem as pointing to God, the missing piece. Our theorems could never be complete and sufficient without God. Let chapter 11 of the book How Science Points to God explain this to you in more details. So this is what you get when you buy the book and read it. These are the chapters. The book can be found at Amazon.com or SophiaInstitute.com.